So we just looked at Nietzsche. We just looked at how Nietzsche described the death of God, how the foundations of Western society have kind of collapsed in a sense, and there's been a rise of postmodern and nihilistic views of the universe and our place in it. It's important that we talk about this because this kind of sets the stage for understanding why it is that the philosophical movements of postmodernism and critical theory are now on the scene and why they are as widespread as they are, as well as why, if you go to college nowadays, you're going to get this stuff and it's going to be taught to you, and why this is kind of the dominant view of society at this point and how and why it needs to change. So I want to start with an encyclopedia entry on this term Foucauldian. This word Foucauldian means anything related to the philosophy or views of the French postmodern philosopher Michel Foucault. In his works, Michel Foucault, who is a really cool historian, traces how the development of knowledge in Western society has been used as a means of social control, and how what counts as knowledge is inseparable from power and the exercising of power of one social group over another. The first thing you need to know if we're going to continue our investigation of critical theory and how Nietzsche's will to power philosophy informs it, is how critical theory looks at society. So, modernism had a rather individualistic view of humans and society, right? It talked about individual rights, how we're all individuals, and how, we should cultivate our own individualities. Critical theory is more collectivist in nature. Its object of conceptual analysis is going to be kind of big systems and social structures and social groups, rather than looking at individual characteristics, individual actions, or individual instances of discrimination and exercising of power. So in critical theory, again, which describes society, provides an idealistic view of society and the norms and values that we would need to embody if we're going to establish social justice, critical theory analyzes society by looking at systems and social structures. It's a very systematic way of doing philosophy. It looks at the interplay of social groups in society, the different institutions we have, how these forces interact and the effects that they have on one another, to kind of espouse these large-scale social theories that try to understand power, the locus of power, and the exercising of power in terms of these higher order structures. Can anybody tell me what a social structure is? Is it a phrase that you've heard before? Is it something that, you've heard thrown around? When people say social structure, they don't mean literally a concrete building. Yeah, that would be an example of a characteristic that has to do with the structures on which society is built, right? So you can kind of think of a social structure as like a complex web of the norms we have in society, the social and legal policies, the laws we have, and the different social relationships that exist. All of these kind of together and how they interact form what are called social structures. They kind of inform human action, inform how we see ourselves in society, and how humans behave in society. So when you think of critical theory, think of somebody who's kind of looking down on society and sees like kind of how all the moving pieces are like interacting and forming patterns. Patterns of how different social groups are impacted by certain behaviors and laws, patterns of how certain social groups behave and what they think, all that stuff. Integral to understanding the critical theorist's understanding of society and what drives humans to do what they do is how knowledge is formed and what constitutes knowledge. Remember, critical theorists want to change the way society works, right? They're not happy with the way things are. One of the reasons for that is they're going to say that the knowledge that we have in society, or what's taken as knowledge, is constructed and disseminated in a particular way. So to establish social justice, to change society, they look at how knowledge is formed and disseminated throughout society. Because people act according to what they know or what they think they know, right? So the knowledge that we have is going to be deeply influential as to how we see ourselves, the world, and how we do things. Part of their analysis of society is thus an analysis of how knowledge is formed and a critique of this process. How information is disseminated to people. How identity is what they will say socially constructed. And how generally society is organized. Who has access to the means of production? Who in our institutions have the power and why? How the economy works. Central to their understanding of how society works, how oppression works, is an idea from this philosopher Michel Foucault that knowledge is socially constructed. again, I'm going to abbreviate critical theory CT here. Michel Foucault, in his historical analysis of different institutions like the prison system, how madness is understood in our society, what it means to be mad and what it means to be normal, how sexuality is treated and what people think of sexuality. In all of these analyses, he looks at how people's knowledge of those topics, of those ways of life, of those institutions, are what he calls socially constructed. Michel Foucault's key thesis in this, which has become a key part of critical theory generally, is that knowledge is not the result of a rational, value-neutral, objective process, but that what counts as knowledge in society is something that the dominant culture or the dominant interests create and then impose on the other cultures and other social groups in society, whether they're doing that consciously or unconsciously. So knowledge is not a means of expressing generally how the world works. Knowledge is rather a power play. The knowledge that we have in society is generally a means of cultivating and exercising social control over other social groups. Oh, this marker sucks. One of the most common ideas or piece of knowledge that is socially constructed that the critical theorists like to point to is the idea of race. Is there a biological foundation for race?
No. I mean, there's skin pigment, but...
So we have different color skin, right? But is there something different about us biologically? Or are we all humans? Or are we all part of the same race? It's generally accepted that there used to be race science, right? People used to think, oh, you can tell what somebody's race is by measuring their forehead or their nose or something, right? Chronology, measuring the shape of the skull will tell you what somebody's race is. We figured that out, that's all bullshit, right? And that really we're all just humans. And though we have different colored skin, we're all part of the same species. Well, the critical theorists are going to say race is an example of how knowledge is socially constructed. It's not actually true that there are real biological distinctions between white people and black people, but rather race was thought up by white people so that they could justify enslaving and treating other social groups in the way that they wanted to. You see what I'm getting at? That they would say that race is socially, and this knowledge of race is socially constructed in this way. That white people just came up with the idea of race, for example, so they could justify, oh, black people aren't like us, they're different, so we can enslave them and do what we want.
I don't agree with that.
Okay, that's what they're going to say.
Yeah, I don't
But we'll come back to that.
Yeah, because like it didn't start with slavery. I think we start right there, like, wait a minute, there's a with
Right,
people,
right.
you know?
But the concept of race was used to justify certain behaviors, right?
Well, I mean, like, in this particular, okay, maybe I'm going too far back in my thinking. I'm thinking like, okay, in the beginning of time, there was no white man walking around saying,
Right,
like,
right.
I mean, so I don't think the white man, I just think supremacy is like mental, it's a mental illness. Like, you have to.
The critical theorists are going to agree with you on
I
that.
think it's mental illness. I think like, you can't make me feel like you're oppressing me or oppressing me, or you can't
Okay,
make me feel like you're
well,
superior.
hold on to that, because we'll come back to that. Hold on to that. So they'll point to things like race, or they'll point to things like gender, or they'll point to this idea that science is the best way to get knowledge of the universe. That's not true. That's just something that the dominant culture has imposed on people, so to get them to act and live in a certain way. So the critical theorists think that knowledge, by and large, is socially constructed. What counts as knowledge, what is something that society decides upon and agrees to. The dominant culture, or what the critical theorists might call the dominant interests, create and disseminate knowledge to serve their own interests and maintain them. And when they say dominant culture or dominant interests, they usually mean white men.
I thought you were going to say money.
Well, money is only a part of what they're going to call white supremacy. So, yeah, we'll get to that. Down the line, more specifically next week probably. We're just kind of laying a foundation here. If you have the reading in front of you, James Lindsay explains this pretty well on page 2 of this entry on Foucauldian. The term Foucauldian refers to ideas that were produced by or that derive from the thinking of the French postmodernist Michel Foucault. Foucault's thinking, particularly his thoughts on knowledge, power, and the way we use words and speak, discourses, and the relationships between these have been incredibly influential on the development of critical theory. Indeed, many of Foucault's ideas lie at the very core of the woke worldview. Do you remember what woke means? It means being awakened to critical consciousness, seeing how there are certain systems and structures in society that function to hold certain social groups down. The starting place for the Foucauldian view of knowledge, power, and discourses is that knowledge is socially constructed and has been defined in the service of power, so knowledge and power are the same thing. And what we consider knowledge may have little or nothing to do with reality outside of its political application. Simply, Foucauldian thought sees truth or knowledge as something that arises within a particular culture. That is, a true statement to Foucault is one that a particular culture at a particular time and place in history and geography believes is true, regardless of whether or not that corresponds to reality. Put another way, Foucault's view is that the truth of a statement is entirely a function of the cultural milieu in which it is being considered. And moreover, that whether something counts as knowledge is set by the dominant and powerful interests and groups in society, usually in a way that serves those interests and works to maintain them. Foucault, for instance, in his book History of Madness, is particularly concerned with the way that dissident ideas are excluded from the dominant discourses, thus from having any political influence, by being labeled with the socially constructed concept of being mad. In his History of Sexuality, he argues similarly about the ways that homosexuals were controlled by the changing authoritative and scientific views of homosexuality throughout history. This means that for Foucault, knowledge and power are the same thing. Power knowledge. And all claims on knowledge are ultimately just political devices. This idea that knowledge is kind of something that the dominant culture agrees upon and then kind of gets others to believe and imposes on other groups is related to two important concepts in critical theory that we need to memorize if we're going to have a good discussion moving forward. One of these is called an episteme, or an episteme. I'm not really sure how to pronounce it. It's a weird French word. An episteme is, quote, the set of dominant discourses, or ways of speaking, the set of dominant discourses that define how it is and is not acceptable to think about various ideas in a particular historical and geographical setting. Wherever there is society, in each society, in each historical age, there is an episteme, a dominant way of understanding and thinking about things. In our age, science is a big part of this, right? There's an acceptable way of thinking and speaking about how the universe works in the United States. And if you talk about God, if you talk about religion, if you talk about magic crystals, you're made fun of, right? Science is a part of the episteme that we have. So, wherever there's a society, they go through different epistemes, different dominant ways of thinking and speaking about the world and themselves. And epistemes are basically molded by the dominant group in society, the dominant interests. In medieval society, the episteme was the Christian worldview, right? And that was molded by the dominant culture, the dominant interests, the priests, the monks, the Christian theologians, right? This also brings up another concept which is really important for understanding critical theory. This idea of standpoint epistemology. What's epistemology? What's that again? What does that have to do with? Knowledge, right. Standpoint epistemology is the view that your position in society the social groups that you're a part of, the race you are, the gender, the sex that you are, gives you special insight into how society works. Put it another way, standpoint epistemology is the view that one's social position relative to systemic power, relative to who the dominant culture is, who's imposing their will and their knowledge on you, gives you special insight into how society works and how your particular social group or groups are oppressed. And it makes another claim too. Not only do you have special insight into how society works based on your social position, but it argues that knowledge of, if you're not a part of the dominant group, if you're not a part of the dominant interests, your knowledge should be privileged, and we should listen to you. So the critical theorists are going to say the dominant culture in the U.S. are the white male Christians. And if you're not white, if you're not a male, if you're not Christian, you have special insight into how society works that white male Christians don't have, and that we should listen to you to figure out what it is that you feel and what your lived experience is so that we can better change society. So for example, if you're a woman, you have insight into how you're oppressed in society that a man does not have. If you're black, for example, standpoint epistemology says you have special insight into how you're oppressed in virtue of being black that a white person does not have. If you're Hispanic, same thing. If you're queer or gay, you also have special insight into how society oppresses that a straight person does not have, because the majority of people are straight. These views are really important for understanding critical theory, because they form the core of it. This is why the critical theorists are going to say, generally, white people don't really have any special knowledge or insight when it comes to race. You got to listen to the other social groups. Or why we need to listen to the lived experience of non-whites and non-men, because they have special insight into how society works. Did I explain this okay? Do you understand what I'm saying by this? I'm not asking you if you agree at this point. Just, does it make sense? Okay. Now let's go. This is all kind of what James Lindsay talks about in that article on Foucauldian. Let's now move over to the other reading that I asked you to do, which was from chapter 2 of Oslam Sensoy and Robin Diangelo's book, Is Everyone Really Equal? Key Concepts of Social Justice Education. Can you guess what they're going to say? Is everyone really equal? What do you think?
No.
Very good. They're going to say no. We're not actually equal. White people have privilege, they have advantage that other people don't, that other races don't. Men have privilege and advantage that other genders and sexes do not. I don't know if I like blue. They start off by restating this Foucauldian idea that we're investigating. That knowledge is historically, culturally, and racially informed. The knowledge that we have in society, or what is claimed to be knowledge, is not, like I said before, the result of an objective, rational, unbiased process, but that people's class, people's race, people's biases play into what counts as knowledge in our society and whether or not someone has knowledge. Rather, they're going to say, like James Lindsay just described, the knowledge and values of the dominant culture reign, and they have created a society which marginalizes and oppresses non-men and non-whites. You might see phrases like the system or the status quo. These are all ways of referring to the dominant culture or the dominant interests. Do y'all know what I mean when I use the word marginalize? Does anybody know what marginalize means?
It's kind of like similar to oppress.
Right,
Yeah.
it is. So yeah, y'all have written in Microsoft Word or Google Docs, right? Y'all are familiar, like on the edges of the pages you have margins.
Mm-hmm.
You know, oh, do you want the margin to be 1 inch? Do you want it to be ½ an inch?
Like push aside.
Right. When you're marginalized, your voice isn't heard, you're ignored, you're thrust aside. You're not made important, you're ignored. You're not paid attention to. Your experience is not heard, you're not valued. So the critical theorists are going to argue that basically the development of Western society, Western history, it's one long power game that white men have been playing against other social groups. And that the white men have created a system which functions to oppress people who are not them. Have you heard this before? Is this a view that you've heard? This is critical theory. We're going to look at two particular critical theories next week, critical race and critical gender theory. Today we're just kind of doing more abstract, general stuff here to build up our knowledge. Oslam Sensoy and Robin Diangelo say in this book, this is almost an exact quote, critical theory, which I'm going to abbreviate CT, calls into question the idea that objectivity is desirable or even possible. Not only is trying to be objective in matters, scientific, statistical, being objective in matters is not desirable, and it's not even possible, because your objectivity is not a real objectivity, it's just a function of your biases, of your standpoint. So you can't be objective. And in fact, being objective hurts people. You need to listen to their lived experience. You need to listen to how they feel they are being treated by society. This brings us to another really important concept in critical theory, this idea of positionality, which is related to standpoint epistemology. Positionality is the view that where you stand in relation to others in society shapes what you can see and understand about the world. Sorry for the squeaking. I'll get a different marker. So again, your standpoint, what race you are, what class you are, whether you're part of the bourgeoisie or the proletariat, whether you live in a low-income neighborhood or a high-income neighborhood, whether you have a big family, where you stand in society shapes what you can see and understand about the world. So they're going to say, for example, that white men are blind to the oppression that society causes non-whites and non-men because they can't see it. They're not living that life. They're not being affected in the same way that these policies, norms, and laws affect other social groups. So it's related heavily to this standpoint idea that where you are in society in relation to other people gives you a certain amount of insight into how it all works. And so what they say in relation to this idea that where you stand in society gives you a certain knowledge, a certain insight, a certain way of doing things, that there is not one way, objective way of viewing and seeing things. There's not one knowledge. There are, in fact, many different kinds of knowledge. What was that? You hate that? Well, we're going to have plenty of time to talk about it, especially next week when we dive into critical race and gender theory. So they're going to say things like, look, there are many different kinds of knowledge you can have. If you are a white person that grew up in a really nice neighborhood, you can get away with doing coke with your friends on the weekends and the cops don't bother you. And you know how the neighborhood works. That's one kind of knowledge. What you're taught in school from your teachers, that's a different kind of knowledge. What you learn on the job as a member of the working class, that's a different kind of knowledge. Based on your way of life, based on your positionality, you have a different knowledge than other people, and they have a different knowledge than you. There's the knowledge that you're getting in my class. This would be called mainstream academic knowledge, which they're going to say has some blind spots. It doesn't completely describe how everything works. It's one particular white man's way of viewing things. Again, there's personal knowledge, the knowledge you have in virtue of your personal experiences. There's knowledge that most of society believes, that's popular knowledge. There are as many as there are people, you can say that there are that many knowledges. And they're going to call the knowledge that you're getting from reading their book, from being woken up to critical consciousness, transformative knowledge. Because it's knowledge that helps you transform society. And so I want to hammer home how deep this rabbit hole goes on knowledge, and how knowledge is socially constructed. What many critical theorists are going to say is everything that can be said to be known is therefore socially constructed. Wow, that red, really bright. What are some things that you think you know? Or what are some things that you claim can be known? Anything.
Speed of light.
Sure.
182,000. Yeah.
What else? How about race? The concept of race is just something that we came up with and have agreed to. How about your values? That's just socially constructed too. The values that you live by, or that you think are right, rather, it's just stuff that people agree to, kind of arbitrarily, and you're just following that, you're going along with it. How about history? History is socially constructed. This one's really easy to see. How do you learn about history? You read what other people have said and that people that didn't write it agree to. Everything that you think that you know is just stuff that people in society have agreed is knowledge, and that we act out and that we live out. How about class? Are there really classes of people? Is there a difference between you and me? Or are we just humans? We're just humans, right? If we're members of different classes, that's just something we kind of made up and imposed and agreed to and have agreed to follow.
So this is what you meant by there's a kind of playful nature to, I suppose, modernism, where you could apply this to the document itself.
Yes, you could, yes.
You could say, like, well, this is...
Of course, the critical theorists, however, are not going to do that, because the critical theorists do think there is, they will say there is the way things are. And they're going to say the way things are is that white men are ruling over everybody and imposing their interests and values on others, and they're oppressing other social groups.
Is that it? That's all that theory is?
It's more than that. It's a lot. It's more complex than that. What else is something you can claim to know? How about what a table is? What is a table?
Human perception.
We defined what a table is. We came up with the definition of a table. We could have used a different word for table. We could have meant something else by table. We could have called this a table, right? Could have called this a table. Government, politics, religion. Socially constructed. What's religion? It's just a bunch of people getting together, agreeing that someone or something is God, and agreeing to do some rituals, and agreeing that those rituals have a certain value. So this idea that knowledge is constructed goes very deep. They really want to get across to you this idea that what you think you know is probably just something that was imposed on you from another social group or from the dominant culture. Again, there's this idea that until you're woke, until you've been awakened to seeing it all like this, you have a false consciousness. You don't really understand how things are. You think you understand how things are. Except if you're a minority, if you're not white, if you're not a man, you do have some kind of insight into how things are. Because again, you are being oppressed by the structures. So you have a certain lived experience that you can consult, and you're like, oh yeah, let's say you're a black male, and you go into a convenience store, and people are looking at you funny. Your lived experience is, oh snap, people looked at me funny. That's evidence that there's like maybe some values and beliefs and stereotypes about black people that aren't good or aren't right. And you have that lived experience that you can consult, right? That expresses to you that the oppression is real. So, generally, what counts as knowledge in our society is something that has been socially constructed throughout time, throughout history, by whoever has been the dominant group, whoever has constituted the dominant interest. Who has that been historically? The critical theorists are going to say it's been European white men who have imposed their ways of viewing and understanding the world on other social groups, and they've constructed society in a way that benefits them, that maintains their interests, that gets them to cultivate more power. And again, at the heart of this is a very Nietzschean idea that the values that you have, the beliefs that you have, you need to critically examine those because odds are they were imposed on you by the dominant social group. Power, therefore, is the driving force of human action. All these words, all these concepts, these ideas, these values, they were created, probably unconsciously, but sometimes consciously, in order for the dominant group to cultivate and exercise social control over everyone else. It splits the world into classes of oppressor versus oppressed. And the reason that society is like this is because, again, people fundamentally are after power. So society, by and large, is not a cooperative enterprise, but a struggle for power among social groups. Therefore, the proper view of history, the woke, the awakened view of history, is one of domination and oppression, primarily by whites and men against others. To this end, if we want to change things, if we want to make it so that social groups are not oppressed, if we want to fix society, first of all, what we need to do is we need to become awakened to the fact that all this is happening. And we need to focus on attending to the lived experiences of people who are undergoing this oppression. And of course, we also have to engage in activism if we want to turn things around. Therefore, and this is kind of the overarching goal or the overarching ethos, we need to demolish Western society and build a new because it's rotten to the core. Reform is not going to do it because merely reforming the system isn't going to get rid of the racism and the sexism and the homophobia and the transphobia and all the other forms of oppression that are way down in the roots. Reform isn't enough. We need to disrupt and dismantle. They say we're going to need to demolish the whole thing and start again. Now let me just say one more thing. I've been talking rather generally, been talking about the goals and the aims and the way that the critical theorists see society. I want to give you some concrete fields or concepts that are related to this way of doing philosophy, that think this is the way things are. Like I said before, we're going to look at two particular views, two particular critical theory views. One of them which centers or talks about the concept of gender, critical gender theory, and one which looks at the concept of race, critical race theory. But these are not the only critical theories that exist. There are many offshoots of critical theory that look at different aspects of society that focus on different ways knowledge is constructed, that focus in deconstructing that knowledge in different areas. And these views all incorporate the basic premises that society is oppressive and needs to be changed. Knowledge is constructed, and that's how these views and values and ideas get imposed on others, and why the society maintains and reproduces itself and doesn't just fall apart. One of the subfields of critical theory is this idea of postcolonial studies. Who can guess what this is about? Postcolonial studies.
The British.
Yeah, that's a part of it, yeah.
After.
Yeah. Generally, post-colonial studies looks at how colonization is oppressive and the impacts colonization has on colonized peoples. There's disability studies. Who can guess what they're looking at in disability studies?
How people with disabilities have been looked upon in society.
Right. How people with disabilities, in fact, well, they would say that this word is offensive because it implies that people who have, what are disabilities are something that are made up by the able-bodied. But disability studies is going to look at how disabled people are oppressed in society, how they don't have their needs met, they don't get the proper services, how they fall through the cracks. There's fat studies. What do you think these people are looking at?
Body image.
Right. Ideas related to beauty and human health. They're going to say that fat people are treated a certain way in society, a certain negative way. They're going to say that our society thinks that thinness is the standard and thinness is good, and so it marginalizes fat people. They're going to look at all the different ways that fat people are harmed by how we do things in society. And then, like I said before, there's critical race and gender theory. So they're going to look at how race has been constructed, how gender has been constructed, and how people with particular races, who are members of a particular race and who are particular genders, are treated differently by society, oppressed, marginalized, not listened to, not valued. And some examples of critical race and gender theory, even more subfields, would be queer theory. How people who either aren't straight or people who don't identify as a man or woman, but they identify as agender, or they identify as non-binary, they don't fit neatly into the category of man or woman, how society oppresses them, and how the way we do things in society marginalizes them and doesn't allow their voices to be heard. Also in this critical gender camp, you have LGBTQIA+ studies. How lesbians, gay people, bisexuals, trans, queer, I forget what the I.
It's intersex.
What is it?
Intersex.
Intersex and then asexual.
That's right.
What's the point of sex?
How these different people aren't, because they're not part of the dominant culture, there are certain challenges and experiences that they have that would differ from, example, a straight person or somebody who does not transition between genders or sexes. There's whiteness studies. Which looks at how this one's a little bit harder to put into words because it's decoupled from the idea of the white race. Whiteness studies looks at those systems and those structures that have been developed primarily by white people for white people, and how even people who don't look white can be politically white by maintaining those systems and structures. And then there's one more thing that I want to mention, which is very important for kind of tying all of this together and giving some insight into how these different identities and how these different studies kind of intersect. And that's the idea of intersectionality. Does anybody know what intersectionality is?
I think we learned about it in my city university life. It's basically when someone is firm with like both parts a little bit.
Right. So intersectionality is the idea that your experience in society and how you feel oppressed and what that oppression looks like is a function of all of the intersecting parts of your identity. So let's say, for example, that you're black, you have a certain experience of oppression. But if you're black and female, you have a unique experience of oppression that a black man doesn't have, for example. And if you're a black queer female, you have an even different experience of oppression, and that all of these identities of which you are a part form the certain experience that you have. I just said a lot. I don't think we have much time left here, but I wanted to make sure to get all this out to you so you all understand kind of what they're saying, what they're studying, the different fields that they're developing. Does anybody have any thoughts, concerns, opinions about this stuff? We'll have more room to discuss when we do talk about the critical race and critical gender theory, because these are like the two big ones that a lot of people are doing work in nowadays.
Yeah. I'm just, with all of this, I'm really looking forward to the next class.
Yeah, next class is going to be more discussion based, for sure. I know I've done a lot of lecturing today, but I wanted to make sure, I wanted to expose you to this so you can understand the inner workings of this stuff. So when you see these words pop up in society and culture, when you see words like white privilege, systemic racism, if you see something like culturally responsive education, they're all doing this critical theory stuff. And these are the basic premises and views and things that they're looking at. So white privilege is this idea that in virtue of being white, you have a particular privilege in society that non-whites don't have. Systemic racism is this idea that racism probably isn't what you think it is. It's not the definition that you're probably used to. It's this idea that racism is something that's normal and it's baked into everyday life and how people see themselves and others. And then culturally responsive is just an adjectival phrase kind of describing what, like critical theory education or critical theory pedagogy.
It is interesting seeing the course broadly and then just realizing from my perspective, it's just like, oh, we caught up. This is what's going on now.
Right. I wanted to do a unit on this because this is what y'all are going to be exposed to and are being exposed to right now. So it helps understanding it and knowing, what they're getting at. Right?
So this is all stuff that they're like, I've been glancing or seeing all these things about how they have this new curriculum and kind of instill into the classroom and you have to one side is against it and one side doesn't.
Right. Yeah. This is a hot topic. There are people in society, in the United States, for example, that love it, and there are people that hate it. There are people that think it's right, there are people that think it's dead wrong.
I mean, I'm thinking that, you live long enough, I keep saying that, but I'm just thinking it's really like a possible bit. It has nothing to do with any of that. It has everything to do with money. Seriously, even racism, when they get slavery and all, that was never about your race. That was about people making money. They used those people in slavery to produce products that they could buy, sell, pay up their taxes to. It was always about money. That's all it's about. So all these different things, I guess it's just something to talk about and something to have on the plate too. But that is not the core value of any nation. It's about the dollar. If you have more money, okay, you might be a little. Okay, I put it this. I might look at your equivalent if your bank account has more than mine. You see what I'm saying? You have more access to things that I can't get. You never know, that person's a little bit more, up to because they have more money than I do. If you don't have more money than I do, you can't arrest me. You can't even make me feel any type of way because the color of your skin. No, I'll just drive around you as you walking past me. You understand?
Right. Yeah.
In real world, adults we look at what's your tax record? What's your credit score? How much your house worth? The real questions of when I see you in the street, I don't think, well, that's a white man. I think that he's working. What do you do? What is your profession? What is your annual income? That is the stuff that determines what kind of person you are when you really sit down and start talking to them. Or you just see them from way over there and making a long distance judgment on them. Then that's just stupidity. Because you haven't even sat down and asked this man, do he own a piece of property? You wouldn't even have voting rights if you didn't own a piece of property in the beginning of this country.
Well, we're going to come back to that with critical race theory. There's one of the founders of critical race theory, Derek Bell, who is a lawyer at Harvard. He began his work by looking at the way laws impact people of different races. And he actually thought that Brown versus Board of Education wasn't progress for black people. It was actually a veiled form of white supremacy. So maybe we'll talk about that next time.
It sounds like to me, it's like a first thought of let's keep pushing this ideal that white supremacy is a lot, and because of the white, everything you kept saying, I kept saying, oh, I like white men. What are you talking about? I'm not attracted to white men. What are you talking about? Talking about some men like that. So I don't know. I just think it's like a backwards way of pushing this white supremacy by saying, if you put it in everybody's mind from especially teaching them that white supremacy and tribalism, people don't think that way. It's like they're pushing that thought on people. They don't think that way.
Hold that, because we'll talk about that next class. Can you please make sure to sign the attendance sheet on your way out? I forgot to pass that out. But thank you, you're all good to go.
Can you please share?
See you next week.
Yeah, see you next week.
Yeah.